Welcome everybody to another episode of Coffee and Open Source. I'm super excited for our guests today. We're going to have tons of fun talking about their experiences in the open source world and some of the cool things that they do for their job. I'm out of coffee now. This is, hopefully my guests can get us energized and let's go. So today I'm very excited. My guest is Michael Crump. Say hi, Michael. Yeah, so that's super exciting. For folks that don't know, Michael and I both work at Microsoft. We used to be on the same team, and then he moved on to more interesting pastures. Not to say our jobs aren't interesting, but he's working on some really cool stuff, which I hope we're going to talk about in a bit. But Michael, at first, whenever we do these conversations, and you and I talk a lot about just random things, so I'm curious to know. Do you remember the first time that you interacted with open source or had kind of a moment where you're like, oh, like this is stuff that is free and available and I'm using it and I could potentially give back if I'd like to? Mm-hmm. That's awesome. So somebody just said that we don't have audio for you, so let me fix that. All right, can you try now?
Hello, hello, hello.
All right. Well, I think we're better now. For some reason, OBS automatically muted your audio stream, so that's cool. So, so for the folks that didn't hear Michael, he was kind of talking about how he, when he got started in open source, and he was talking about SourceForge and Codeplex and this kind of fun game, right? I think a lot of people, when they come across free software, and they're either people that have been in tech for a while and they're experiencing a situation where they need access to things that have been built without having to quote unquote reinvent the wheel. And there's the other type of folks, right? These folks that maybe they're not in tech at the moment, maybe they're younger, maybe they're career changers, and they
Oh
come
yeah.
across something and they're like, oh, this is kind of cool. Like in your situation, a game, right?
Mhm.
And then they kind of go down this path of like, okay, who would spend all this time making this game for free, letting people play it for free, and also just making sure anybody can use it and change it if they want to, right? Which I think is super cool.
Oh
Um,
yes.
yeah. So as you kind of after the game and you started playing with that a little bit, like, do you remember what kind of captivated you about it? Do you remember like why you found it so interesting, other than it was just a game and it was fun?
Pretty much it was just something that I thought was fun. I may have actually had a practical like use for it back in the day, which made me want to like look into it a little bit more. But yeah, just like what you're saying. I mean, from there, we started to see, GitHub before it was with Microsoft and how easy it was to like search through. And I will say pretty much everything that I build today, it's 100% off the work of other like open source developers. And yeah, I've got a project that I can mention if you'd like for me to. A recent thing I started working on.
Oh, of course. I think that this is an opportunity for you to plug all of your stuff, right? Um, I do like knowing more, just kind of about career progressions too, as well,
Hmm.
right? Like I know your career progression pretty good. Do you
Yeah.
and But I guess at least from my understanding, there's a particular change, basically something that changed and that kind of moved you, I guess, forward. Like so when you joined Telric, right? You want to
Yes.
just talk about that experience and what
Yeah.
your time at Telwork was like?
Yeah, actually, I can back up a little bit further or earlier in my life. So now I'm a 41-year-old dude, and so in my lifetime, when I really started, when I was really kind of got me hooked was QBasic.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, so this was back in high school. I know I've told some of these stories to my children, and they're like, "What do you mean? You only had one computer in the whole high school?" And I was like, "Yeah." So anyway, we had one computer.
Yeah.
You had to check it out, and you could only maybe get 30 minutes at a time. But I did that, and I found QBasic, and I started putting together a role-playing game. Now, um, some of the open source stuff comes in right after this, but I started building a role playing game, and it was pretty bad, really bad actually. It was like one of those text based adventures.
Yeah.
I was a lot more into gaming when I was like in high school.
Sure.
Obviously now I haven't played games in a long time, but in high school I played a lot of games, and so that was where a lot of that inspiration I think like came from. So QBasic to role playing games. After I finished high school, I went to a local community college to start in computer science, which I'm one of the few, I guess, fortunate people that I always kind of knew what I wanted to do.
Sure.
But even before, I went to that community college, I ran like a BBS. And for those of you who may not know, BBS is bulletin board systems, and you could dial into that BBS and others could dial into it, and you may exchange like messages,
Mm-hmm.
play different. They were called doors back in the day. Those were games. Again, lots of gaming stuff
Yeah.
that was all around there, and so that most of the BBS software that I had used was also open source, but it wasn't one of those things where there was nice websites put together, easily searchable, and you would find it. A lot of it just came by other users that said, "Hey, I found this package over here. You can use it. Go for it." So yeah, so this really the BBS is where some of that first came in. So the door games or the games, or the games that they call doors. There were several of those. It was completely free, and there's others. Obviously you'd pay for, but I wanted all of the free, like open source games
Sure.
on
Yeah.
my BBS. And so yeah, moving into like the next little bit, um, I spent some time working right after high school, college in computer science, EE, and then obviously I went on to a university. But right after that, I actually worked as a software developer for 8 years, right out of college. So I worked at McKesson, they're a
Okay.
Fortune 500. I spent a lot of time in the healthcare field. And then after I kind of did that for 8 years or so, I started to work at a hospital. In that hospital, I got to learn a lot more about open source and if you're using it like in healthcare type of environments. There's a there's a lot of things you've got to check for if you're using open source software in a healthcare application, because obviously that if there's a bug introduced into that open source piece, well then it's going to be inside the actual application,
Yeah.
and that could be not a good thing. And then Telerik, obviously, I was working as a developer for those all that time, and then when I joined Telerik, I was really enjoying the whole like teaching like part of it. I had done some like classes, some college classes, taught a few college classes, and so I was like, oh, this is pretty neat. But I wanted to be a little bit on a bigger scale. And so at Telerik, I was a developer advocate for almost 5 years. So almost 5 years there. I worked a lot on the .NET products, and then eventually I needed to do some work over on iOS. So so controls for your iPhone. And
Oh,
so we
okay.
had launched the product suite from that, and so I was doing a bunch of stuff with ensuring that we had controls that iOS developers would want to use. And just to finish the progression, um, uh, after Telerik, I joined Microsoft.
Hmm.
I came in here for an iOS product that was open source, Windows Bridge for iOS.
Oh, okay.
If you do a search for it, it's still completely open source. It was open source day one. And I just remember this was 2015. So, like, coming in, it was one of those things. It's like, okay, we've got something open source. It's not anything that like we're selling or anything like that. We just want people to use it. And anyway, coming in brand new into like Microsoft, that will to me was a different type of like mindset. Um, and I know Microsoft had done tons of open source stuff before that, but it was very interesting to me that they were hiring me to come on board
Yeah.
to work on a product that they're giving away for free.
Sure. Yeah. That's captivating, right? Like a lot of people that have, you know, if they're older, they have there's a perception of Microsoft that doesn't really, match very well to that. And obviously that things have changed to, pretty substantially over the last few years. But I think one of the
Yeah,
things that's really resonating is that uh, Microsoft has always kind of been in this place where you want to get as many eyes on the stuff you're building as possible, right? And I think it took them a long time to figure out that like opportunities to give things for free is a really interesting avenue for that. Um, and
oh
one of the,
yes,
yeah, so but then eventually you came over to Azure Marketing, right, which is
yes,
the team that I work on.
yep.
And what are some of the fun things that you worked on in Azure Marketing that people might know about?
Well, the one that I will say a lot of people, especially in the Azure space, would know is the Azure Tips and Tricks original site. Um, so that's a very interesting project, which you have been running it now for a couple months
Yeah.
and made tons of improvements to it. So that whole thing kind of like spun out of just me looking for quicker ways to figure out how to do things in Azure,
Mm-hmm.
and then secondly, I just can't remember stuff
Sure. Yeah. No.
as I've gotten older. And that site was completely born and spun up by open source projects.
Mm-hmm.
Vue Js. It was a super hot thing. I know a lot of people were making tons of customizations to it. I started looking at it and I was like, okay, you know what? I think we could do a pretty nice site
Mm-hmm.
with Vue. But originally the site was in Jekyll.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
Yeah, just a Jekyll, default kind of like, vanilla
Yeah.
Jekyll instance. And I used Jekyll for a while, but there was some things that Jekyll really didn't stay updated on. So like things like social sharing buttons, or like adding in like, you know, um, just little things at the
Mm-hmm.
bottom that
Yeah.
shows people like how to edit it on GitHub. There was tons of freebies that had came or was starting to come with Vue.js, and so also all the responsive design, even though Jekyll had some of that, it looked wonderful on the devices that I had like around the house.
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah,
Yeah, I mean, so tips and tricks is a really cool concept, right? So I, like Michael said, I run it now with a colleague of mine who you know very well named Vahe, um, and one of the things that we tried to do pretty quickly is, Michael can't do a lot of the work anymore because he's not on the team. So let's figure out ways to automate the work. So we were
yeah,
able to do that some stuff with GitHub Actions, which I thought was pretty fun. Um, but I think also one thing is really cool about tips and tricks is that, uh, it's completely driven by the community, right? Like the
it
people
is.
that post the content and the people that amplify some of the cool things that you can do in Azure. Like they don't have Microsoft employee IDs, right?
That's very, very, very true. And even if you look at like the list of contributors, all of those contributors, they found the project. Sometimes they would find it with a blog post, or they would find it some other ways. I think most feedback that I've received was at the bottom of each page there is a edit
Mm-hmm.
this page in GitHub, which Vue, at least I guess at that time, I know Vue has advanced since then, but at that time, Vue was very much on community helping to maintain and keep like their own documentation like up to date. And so I love that feature because, if there's an edit button that
Yeah,
will take me directly to it, I'm more than likely to help you out versus
this is
like,
true.
yeah, versus stopping and
Yeah,
going to
yeah.
GitHub and like, okay, who is this? Let's go look under Microsoft. Which folder is this in?
Yep.
Make it easy, and people will contribute. And the other piece of feedback that I received was that the folks that were contributing to it, on their CVs or their resumes, they were starting to add, a little bullet item
Mm-hmm.
that they contributed to a Microsoft open source project,
Yep.
and it got accepted. So it was a win for them,
Yep.
and it was an especially a big win, for myself, because it's just too hard to keep all that up to date. It's funny, I had a meeting earlier today on another with another group set of people. And we were talking about that same thing about keeping content up to date and how difficult it is because with anything, everything keeps getting better, or it may change. A screenshot that was active today is now looks totally different. So
Yeah, no, it's totally true, right? I think especially with things like cloud-based services like Azure or any of the other cloud providers or SaaS services, like UIs change pretty quickly, right? And sometimes, you publish some content and it has a couple of screenshots from a portal, and then, in a month you find out that that portal does not look like that any longer, right?
that's
So
true.
community contributions to let you know, hey, this doesn't work, or hey, I see this doesn't work, and I'm going to submit a pull request is extremely valuable, especially with the fact that like tips and tricks, at least it was just you originally, right? And you
Yes,
and you built it to help yourself in the future, like Scott Hanselman says, right? Don't blog for other people, blog for yourself in the future, right? Uh,
that's very good.
I'm in the same boat too, where the amount of times. So right now, I've been fiddling with hosting services in Docker containers running on a Raspberry Pi, and going through this process, I always have to do one particular command to do something, and I always forget what that command is. And I Google the same like 3 words, and it's like the second bullet point every single time, and I click on it, and instead of just remembering it for whatever reason. So without if Google changed their algorithm, I would have to find a different way to find that command. It's so
Oh yeah,
yeah. So with the fact that like I can't remember like a line like that, um, that's why I blog too. Is being able to. It's not just calling out cool things that you're seeing. It's am I gonna have to do this thing or look at this particular piece of tech ever again? And if I do, am I gonna
Yeah.
remember like how to do this one particular thing?
Oh,
I jokingly say all the time that have no idea how to write like link statements in C sharp. Like I have to go to like the link how to page like every time I want to do something more advanced than like a where clause. Um, but
oh
yeah,
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 just like
it's
regular expressions.
well,
I,
I mean, I don't even think I even tried to learn regular expressions. I really don't. Like, I know enough to do like one thing, but like the regular expressions that are like this long, yeah, no, I couldn't write those. Even with like one of the regular expression builders, I don't think I could write one.
I remember I did have to study regular expressions because there was a Microsoft exam, and I'm talking about nothing recent,
Mm-hmm.
10 or so
Oh
years
wow.
ago. There was a Microsoft exam that I took, and I think it was I think it was just C sharp.
Mm.
Um, and I knew there was some regular expression things on there. But yeah, going back to your point there, absolutely. Blog, video, do all of that type of stuff for yourself. I had a funny thing that had happened to me recently. So I use Linux for all of my streaming stuff, and I've been using just Linux. Kali Linux is the flavor I've been using for really the last couple of months.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's one thing that specifically happens to me on my machine, and that is that if I really let the battery go dead, like say I've been playing on it and I set it down somewhere around my house and I go and do some other things and come back 2 days later and pick it up, the date resets on it. So it's probably a CMOS battery or something of that nature that probably needs to be replacing because
Sure.
it's an old computer that I just had, around the
Yeah.
house. And so, in order to set that date, I created a video on resetting the date because you'd think it
Mm-hmm.
would be easy, but there's some steps you should
Sure.
take,
Yeah.
checking time zone and stuff. I created a video on that, and I recently, as of like 3 days ago, went back to my own video to teach myself how to do the same
Very
command that
good.
I did a month earlier.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned time zones because I built a tool. I built a little thing recently that basically allows you to like build schedules for lights in your house, basically to be able
Yeah.
to control the color of those lights. And you know, the preferred mechanism that I tell people is just to here's a Docker image, just spin it up. And when I was first testing it, I was finding out it's like, well, the time is never right inside this Docker container. And I did a little bit of research and I found out that like, oh, by default, like most Docker container images that are based off of like Alpine or any like the major Linux OSs, like they're all default to like universal time, like GMT time. So basically, you have to pass an environment variable to the Docker container when you're starting it up or when you're running it for the first time, saying this is what my time zone is. And you know, it I would say that it's like it's one of those things where you just didn't know, and
Yeah.
I was like, why is it always say that it's like I'm like 6 hours different, and then like a few searches found like oh you just passed this environment variable, and without knowing that I would have been like oh, okay this entire project is not worth it because I can't figure out how to set a time zone inside of a container, um, but like things like that where it's just it's overly like some of the simplest things are overly complicated like as you do things that are quote like outside the norm like I guess
Alias.
building out Docker containers isn't really outside the norm anymore but um
Well,
yeah.
and I'll tell you what blows my mind is that I can spend a whole bunch of time working on like a YouTube video,
Mm-hmm.
and that video will not do nowhere near as well. Yet right now, like one of my like most popular videos of all, sadly to say, is one where I installed Visual Studio Code on Linux.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
um, and it was nothing special.
Yeah.
We downloaded the package. It was just using DPKG,
Yep.
so a package thing there, but it was simple, fast to make, and people still comment on it.
Yeah.
That it helped them, and yeah, like simple stuff like that. General public would probably be looking for something like that. So pretty interesting.
Yeah, and it's funny. Like I feel like I've looked at the same blog for how to install like .NET previews on Linux. There's a script that does it, but in some cases the script doesn't work, based on like the OS that you're using. So like
Yeah.
there's a manual step where you basically set your source files and you download a package and then you extract the package and then you set like the path variable in Bash. And as like again, same thing where it's if I could remember like the 6 commands, it would not be hard at all. But like I gotta go to the same website. It looks the exact same every time. Like copy and paste. It's very very funny that like some of these things, and this is like what open source is, right? Like a lot of
Yep.
people think about open source where it's just like, hey, this is some npm package that I built that does something. Check it out. No, but like when people blog or people build like media content like you or podcasts or streams or this is one way that people get the knowledge sharing to where we want it to be. And
Sure.
and you're one of the people that kind of before I joined Microsoft, I was like, oh, this guy Michael, he's very much like he's always blogging about things that make sense. He's always the content that you build out is always like very spot on, and it's not like from a hey, this is the best thing that you can do because it's a Microsoft thing, right? It's always been like it's this is the best thing you could do like as a developer to make your job easier.
Yeah. Oh, that's just the key. Honestly, I think some of that success has only always been because I think of myself, as a pretty simple guy. I mean, um, being humble, knowing there's always somebody out there that can, help you or
Mm-hmm.
can teach you something, has always made sense to me. And then, yeah, with a lot of the content based stuff that I've worked on, 100%, it's stuff that I typically would run into. And I thought, well, if I'm running into it, others are going to run into it as well. And there's no real such thing as like a super, a person that really knows everything. There's always somebody that can learn something, and uh, and yeah, there. Hey there, Smash 8 tab. Um, is definitely being able to be somebody that can accept it. I have never ever thought of myself as somebody that really knows it all. I've always, I even joke a lot on my stream about, um, you know, maybe we can get this working, maybe we can't, but learning together is really the key, at least in my opinion. And most of the stuff that has been written has always been, as if you were sitting right beside me. Like, let's do it together. Uh, Never anything, that was, such as, hey, this is the best way to do it, or this is the best tool. Yeah, humbleness goes a long way, I believe.
Yeah, it's I think that's it's very true. As somebody who is always working on being more humble, it's definitely awesome when you work with people that are super willing to help out in any scenario, right? I think that's really important. Um, we got a question. So Polder Trash wants to he wants to know a little bit about WSL, right? So his question is what is the or sorry their question is what was the impact of WSL and WSL2 and Docker for Windows been on the way you develop? So I know that you're a Mac guy traditionally, which means that you know a bit about Linux. Do you want to just talk a little bit about some of these, I guess you can call them
Yeah.
Linux concepts being introduced into Windows and how they've kind of helped you whenever you do need to build things on Windows?
Oh yes. So WSL, WSL2, I've used both of those pretty much such since the beginning. And if others may or may not know what those concepts are, those are Windows subsystem for Linux. Um, the one or the traditional kind of default that a lot of people go to is Ubuntu
Mm-hmm.
as their Linux. For this is just for the Windows subsystem for Linux. They typically go with Ubuntu, but you can install other operating systems
Yeah.
such as Kali Linux. We did Kali Linux before on Windows. What has that really done and changed for me? Well, I already know, or I feel that at least I'm comfortable enough in Windows. I mean, in Bash, or the Bourne shell, that I don't have to necessarily learn or go back to command prompt
Yeah.
kind of days. So I can reuse that skill set that I have, with Linux and navigating the file system. And different little funny things, like the word clear versus CLS,
Yeah.
the differences between the two, and like DIR, in command prompt versus like LS
Mm-hmm.
in the Linux world.
Yep.
Um, I really was able to take that skill set from Linux and bring it back over to Windows. And also, I didn't have to necessarily like give up. Before, I would do things like I'd have like a SSH session that I would go into one of my Linux machines. Now, if there's little simple things, and I get this all the time, like there's a little, maybe like a simple script or something that I
Yeah.
want to try. I'm already at Windows, and for work, I do use Windows now 100%. But I'd like to be able to try those without actually spinning up another box. WSL2, though, I think really started to kind of change the game, or at least for me. We installed with WSL2, we actually were able to install the GUI version of Kali Linux through Windows Subsystem for Linux. There was a thing that's called WinKex,
Oh, okay.
WinKex. That's only possible through Windows Subsystem for Linux 2, because WSL2 had different, it supports a lot more of the GUIs, and it didn't do any of that in the past. Um, I have personally Docker for Windows. Um, I have installed that. I have not had personally a lot of great success with Docker for Windows. I've had lots of issues with like the client crashing or whatever, but I have used Docker for Mac, and Docker for Mac have had literally no issues, and that is the 100% truth. I don't know why the Windows application for Docker, has so many issues. Maybe it's because how open, Windows really is now, with different types of, uh, virtualization technologies that's already out there by default.
Yeah, and one of the things that's interesting, so Smash A Tap brings up an interesting point, right? So WSL2 breaking the ideology of open source, right? So my personal opinion on it is, uh, it it like for the people that don't know, so WSL2 it actually ships a Microsoft built version of the Linux kernel on top of Windows, right? So when you spin up WSL2, like for instance like Ubuntu or Penguin or one of those type of distros, it's like it's not running just virtualized Linux operating system on a Windows kernel. It's an actual Windows kernel that exists at the OS it's on top of. And so from my particular perspective, I don't know if it breaks an ideology of open source, but it's definitely very interesting, right? Um, I don't know, and I would have to take a look if what Microsoft's I guess how open the things that they're building. I do know the WSL2, the kernel itself, is available on GitHub to download, so or at least view. So I mean, at least from my perspective, I'm not 100% sure if it breaks the open source ideology because I guess the things they're building are built in the open, so to speak. But I think the biggest thing to call out about it is that it is substantially different for folks. Instead of having like a Linux based computer, right? It's going through Windows to get to your Linux-based computer, which I think is interesting because Linux obviously is an open source, not just an operating system, but it's an open source idea as well. I mean, I do think
Yeah.
it's interesting. I'd like to know what your thoughts are, Michael.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing I will say about WSL2 is that I did a conference. WSL was by Hayden Barnes, and he was working at, is it Canonical?
Yeah, so we've interviewed Hayden as well. So he works at
Yeah,
Canonical,
Canonical.
which is the
Yeah.
company that actually makes Ubuntu, right?
Yes, and well, during that, there were several great people. Actually, you just had her on the other week, Kayla
Yep.
Cinnamon. She's one of the program managers on Terminal. I believe I got that correct.
Yep.
But yeah, obviously I learned from that whole, conference and from her, from other folks, that the work that we're doing, or the work Microsoft was doing, or they're currently doing, is still, it's great for WSL too, but it also goes back and helps contribute to the broader community. So, so Ubuntu, inside of those releases, a lot of that work is packaged in. So it really is open source, at least in my mind. And others have obviously made different flavors of their own subsystem for Linux. So yeah. Anyway, pretty cool stuff. Pretty cool stuff that I think that they're still contributing to, and it's not, yeah, it's not all just for Windows, because also they have to work with all the different Linux distros, just to make sure that everything's going to work, work fine. And I think that's pretty hard.
Yeah, I mean, that's a yeah. If you're a company that is very dependent on revenue generation like Microsoft is, right? There is a fine line to balance between making software that's completely free and using the quote quote unword open, and making software that is quote unquote closed and attempting to make money from it. I think Microsoft, at least with my very biased opinion, does this fairly well, right? I think when and Smash has another valid point about, at the end of the day, like, all of the Linux stuff could be open in WSL, but the interface that exists that basically allows Windows to host a version of the kernel is not. It's not available for people to look at, right? Um, I see the point, I guess, from my perspective. I'd be curious to know, like, what the overall, like, interest is on that. It might be something that Microsoft has done a good amount of research with, and, like, are people actually interested in how we build the kernel? So
That,
yeah, go ahead.
yeah. No, I was going to say that would be interesting. Uh, Honestly, outside of our conversation today, I haven't heard many other people asking about, how we build that kernel.
Yeah.
Um, so yeah, pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that there's always areas of interest for, like, I mean, I probably would be interested in it, but I wouldn't understand what's going on because I can't write low level language very well. It's been years, but I do think that there's, I guess, one it's one of the reasons why we attempt, like, and this is Microsoft's, I believe, what their opinion is that if we can get folks that are I don't want to say native to Linux, but they like working at Linux. If we can give them an option to do what they love to do in Linux on Windows, they could potentially be future Windows customers. And I think that's the overall goal. I do think as well that as Microsoft tools become more and more quote unquote cross platform, there introduces basically a necessity to have, like, as close to a, a canonical, not a company name, the actual word canonical implementation of Linux that you can test things on.
Yeah.
Like .NET Core, or if you write code in Python or Java or Node, being able to run these things in other, I guess, operating system environments is extremely important. Um, and
Yeah.
and in the past, we would be given, when we were developers, we'd be given a Windows machine, and then we would be given a Mac laptop, and then
Yeah.
or potentially a VM that had some version of Linux on it that you could SSH into. And I think all of that is kind of, I guess, the need for it is dwindling, right? There'll always be people who always probably need Mac and Windows, just because if they build iOS or OS X native apps, but that's even kind of going away, right? Like, the idea of having, you don't, now if you want to build stuff in .NET Core, you don't even need an iPhone, which I think is really, really interesting.
Oh
um,
yeah.
yeah.
I mean, yes. No, no, I get everything. Like, everything you're saying is spot on. And especially when I joined Microsoft, again, I was working on the Windows Bridge for iOS team, and I was given a fully specced out 2015 MacBook Pro with, at that point, it was 16 gigs of RAM, and I was given a license of Parallels.
Mm-hmm.
And so with my Mac at that point, I could do Windows,
Yep.
which we needed Windows for, several things at that point. And then the Linux instances, again, those were just once you pay Parallels, I think it's like $100 a year. Um, they give you, you can create as many as you want, as
Yeah.
many VMs as you want. And so I would always kind of stick with like a really safe Linux. I call it
Mm-hmm.
safe Linux because Ubuntu just has so much support
Yeah.
out of all of the distros. It's just so easy. There's always a question answered in that flavor. Um, but yeah, also the other thing is that going back, especially that concept of talking about, open source like projects and
Mm-hmm.
how we're using them. Like I feel like everything today, um, a lot of my personal stuff that I do, and then also some of the stuff that I've been building here lately for Learn, um, I'm really leaning on the work of others
Mm-hmm.
um, every single day. And I did a fun little thing for Twitch where, downloading the chat from your stream and then doing parsing. And parsing is extremely hard.
Yeah.
And obviously, we all know there's like many flavors. Microsoft has their own kind of like Newtonsoft.json. I hate to say that, but I just know James Newton King as
Yeah.
the father of JSON parsing.
Sure. Sure.
And so, yeah, I mean, so I use his stuff because number one, it's used everywhere.
Yeah.
And, recently I saw, I think his package was being used in Kenwood receivers for cars.
Mm.
And then even like Nintendo of America, they recently used an open source package, and I remember one of the authors was like, "Hey, woohoo! Nintendo Switch is using my project inside of this
Yeah.
console," which you know you'd think I always think like with consoles and stuff, how secure they have to be because people tend to like pirate or they may
Sure.
want to run homebrew applications, which obviously if it was up to me, I would say do what you want to do with your console. But
Yep.
I'm
Yeah.
not in the business of making a console.
That's very true. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, we're all leaning, we're really leaning already on, work of others, and even like all the like Twitch like integration stuff. There's a Twitch lib. It was actually by one of the live coders had done some work on it. But yeah, with that, uh, it worked great. It saved me a bunch of additional like figuring out how to do things, and so I took a dependency on it, and it's doing, it's one of those things. It does great for my needs. But yeah, almost everything, and even like there's several GUI frameworks for command prompts. So
Yep.
I use .NET Core pretty much in a lot of my little personal little
Sure.
applications
Yeah.
because it's what I feel like I know the best, and it also runs on Linux. It
Yep.
runs on Mac and everywhere else you could think of. But there's several great little front ends. If you're running a command application or console application, it gives you like the nice like little highlighting
Yep.
or menu support where you can use the arrow keys, which some of that stuff isn't built in by default.
Yep.
But yeah, always just leaning on really the work of other
Yeah.
great open source people. And I always feel very, very, very happy if I can contribute something that somebody uses. I have a little silly Node JS bot that I thought nobody would ever care about, but it was tracking like push-ups. I used to do push-ups on my stream, um, and then COVID hit, and I just started eating a lot more. Um,
Yeah. No. Yeah. No. I can attest to that. So, this might be TMI for some people, but I've put on a lot of COVID weight, and then I recently got on some medication that has aggressively suppressed my appetite. So I've
mm,
started to lose lots of COVID weight, which has been nice. But at the same time, I still have a lot of COVID weight to lose. Um, Also, like I yeah, I want to get back to one of your points about you know building on work of others, right? Like uh, I think it's fair to say that myself, I'm a Microsoft fanboy. Like I enjoy a lot of the stuff that Microsoft puts out. I think you are in a very similar vein, probably not as much as me. Uh, but you mentioned a lot of things, right, about .NET Core, and you mentioned terminals that have just more than just the shell itself, like things like Terminal and Windows Terminal. And I think one of the things that's very interesting is that uh, when you look to build tools, it's always about like what tool are you most comfortable with, right? And you mentioned .NET Core. Myself, like I can write Node.js and I can write Python, but I always like if I'm gonna build something, it's always in .NET Core, or like I just because I've been doing it my entire career.
Yep.
Um, and I think it's very interesting, when you have some of these large open source projects that are built on .NET Core and how successful they are. Like we've interviewed Jamie Reese on this stream, and if you don't know Jamie, he created a tool called Ombi, which people use to basically manage their home media.
Oh
So
yeah.
in a similar vein to like a Plex or a
Yeah.
Jellyfin or something like that, right? And it's just him. Like he built it himself, and he's got thousands of contributors and tons of people that want to give back, and he literally just built it because he saw that there was a need, and now it's like this huge, huge, huge project where it's so big. And I found this out a couple of days ago that I don't think he actually builds a Docker container for Ombi. Some other entity took like basically built a Docker container for his tool, which basically just goes to GitHub and pulls down the latest release. And I thought that was very interesting. It's when you get to a point where open source, you build something in open source, and then other people use it to build other open source
Yeah.
things, right? Like, if you don't have the time to build things like to build a Docker container, somebody else could potentially take your bits and build a Docker container around them that works. So actually, I thought is really cool. Um,
Yeah.
and it's interesting because that wouldn't exist without like an entity like GitHub, right? Where code is all available and for you to download and view and all of that, and then obviously interact with the maintainers and people that build that software. Um, yeah,
Yes. I mean, GitHub today, especially if there's some little small, like little like trivial type of application that I kind of want. So an example of one of these is I was looking for a way to post to Reddit's. Reddit has a subreddit called Watch People Code,
yeah,
and I was wanting to programmatically post to that subreddit when I go live.
yeah.
Well, if I lean on the work of others, well, TwitchLib has HTTP listeners
Mm-hmm.
where it triggers with the streams if the stream starts or the stream stops.
Mm-hmm.
So that could take care of a good chunk right there. And then as far as the Reddit C Sharp API, tons of people have already written wrappers
Yep.
for that. So for me, if again, this is just a personal little application, I could probably put something like this together in about, I don't know, I'm going to give myself extra time,
Sure.
2 hours.
Yeah. 2 hours. 2 hours to figure out that you missed a semicolon somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then it'd be like, oh, left it out
Yeah.
there.
Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, to me, that's just the power. And then if I really want to add additional functionality to it, anything else that I may want to, may want to send myself an email. I don't know after it posts to ensure a proper post, or I may want to, send myself a notification if there is like 5 upvotes or something like that on there. And again, more than that, more than likely, that would probably already be in one of those open source Reddit projects.
Yeah. I mean, I totally agree with everything that you're saying. Like it's I built a tool. If people don't know, I built a tool called Presence Light, which has gotten a good amount of interest. But like, I built it solely because I needed to have the functionality that it provides, and then it kind of got some people found out about it, and then it turned into this big thing, and now people use it, and people ping me all the time, like on Twitter or internally at Microsoft, and they're like, "Hey, can you do this or can you help me with this?" And that's like it feels very, very good, and it's not even close to on the scale as something that's like huge, but it still feels really good, to know that people are using things. Yeah, not just they're using something that I built, but they're using something that I built because they had a similar issue as me.
Yeah,
right?
they solved a problem.
Yeah,
And that they leaned on your work and your own time investment and
yeah,
also your own expertise.
yeah,
And again, like I always go back to, James Newton King for JSON parsing.
mm-hmm.
When you're starting to really look at, a more complicated nested JSON file, you know, it's extremely difficult to
Yeah,
figure out how to parse that thing and pull out that little piece of data.
yep,
And if it wouldn't be for that, I would say right now, if James Newton King had never created the original, Newtonsoft.json package, I would say there is probably a whole variety of devices and probably thousands or hundreds and thousands of applications that would have had to have
oh,
either wrote their own or found something else.
oh, that's spot on, right? Like I think I'm pretty certain. I don't want to be 100. I don't want to guarantee 100%, but it's probably the most downloaded NuGet package of all time. Um, Solely, I think, because there was a point in time where it was shipped in .NET Core. Like I
Yeah.
think in like I think in .NET Core 2.1 or something like that, or 2.0, they shipped JSON.NET, the NuGet package, when people like created new projects. Like you go file new ASP.NET Core application, it would actually include a reference to that NuGet package. Which is I can't imagine what James, I'd love to talk to him about it. About like, what was your initial thought about that? Obviously, they talked with you about it, and for people that don't know, James now works at Microsoft. So like, I mean, it's one of those things too. But I think
Totally ping him.
well,
Like,
so
I would love to hear that.
I'm actually trying to talk to him regarding a different thing that I do. So I also, just as a side, I run a program for the .NET Foundation called Project Spotlight, where we basically amplify kind of so different .NET Foundation projects that exist. So I've done like things like Cake, which a lot of people probably know, or .NET Nuke, which people probably know if they're in the .NET space. And I have one that I'm currently building out right now. But I'm in the process of trying to get him to chat about JSON.NET. Um, that's a good reminder to follow up with him because last time I talked to him was before .NET Conf, and he said he was super swamped. But we'll see what he says these days. And,
It,
and
yeah,
and our friend Boulder Trash called out something that's really interesting too about VS Code Server, right? Like this concept that you can run VS Code kind of anywhere.
mhm,
And for folks who don't really know, so VS Code or Visual Studio Code is Microsoft's cross-platform IDE or editor, I guess you could say, for building out applications in a host of different scenarios and languages. And recently, Microsoft took that I guess that tool and the framework that that tool runs and separated out into two different pieces. The client piece, which is the visual piece that people see, the UI and all of that stuff, and then they took the other part, which is the back end, and turned it into its own system. So if you've heard of GitHub Codespaces, for instance, GitHub Codespaces uses the server of VS Code behind the scenes. And then, after that, it's just building a website that interacts with that server, which, I think that's extremely interesting.
yeah,
Um,
and
yeah.
yeah, and even in WSL2, if you go to WSL2 and you type in the word code,
Yep.
well, obviously if you've got it installed,
Hmm.
you type in code and you got your alias and everything already set up. That also uses that server version.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, it's extremely interesting tech. Like I think, and for folks that don't know, GitHub Codespaces, it's currently in private beta. You can sign up for it. I have access to it. I think it's super awesome. Like the amount of times like that I have. So here's a scenario that I don't know if a lot of people have run into. Michael, I don't know if you have either. Is that you're not at your primary workstation, right? And you need to make an edit to a GitHub repo,
yes,
right? But it's not just one file. You need to edit multiple files. If it was just one file, I would just on my phone go to the GitHub website and then edit the file, right? If it was something small. Um, but with GitHub Codespaces, it actually spins up like a workspace for your GitHub repo. So you can modify multiple files. It saves context because it's a VM running in the background. Um, So you have the ability to, make a couple of coding changes, then do like a proper commit, which I think is extremely interesting. And I've done it a lot, like probably more than I would like to say, because it's like, okay, well, why are you making changes to GitHub repos like on your phone?
Yeah.
Don't ask me. I have a couple of scenarios where I have to do it because I needed to make a change to something and I'm not at my desk or whatever, right? So,
Well,
um,
yeah,
yeah.
that happens even, I mean, like even other scenarios is that, so I've been at least walking or jogging 2 miles a day. Again, COVID weight
Yeah.
hit me pretty hard. And so on that computer, I bought just a desktop stand. I don't know what it's called, like a laptop stand or something.
Okay.
And so I can put my laptop up on there and I can see it from there. It's usually though a different machine than
Mm-hmm.
what I'm primarily
Yep.
using.
Yep.
But with Code Spaces, for example, is that I can pick up that project exactly where I left off, on another separate computer that doesn't even have everything installed on it.
Yep.
It's just another just another personal just machine, and I can pick up and I can go from there. So
Mm.
anyway, very, very, very cool.
Yeah. No, I mean, CodeSpaces is awesome tech, and I can't wait for it to be available for everybody to use, which I'm super excited about. So we're running close to the end of our time, so I just want to talk, a little bit about, what you're doing now. Like like I mentioned, you used to be on the same team as me over in Azure Marketing,
Yep.
making all sorts of awesome developer content, and now you're a part of the Learn team, so the Microsoft Learn team. I'd love to know, and I think the viewers would as well, about what you're doing there and how we can check out some of the stuff that you've been building.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So I'm on the Microsoft Learn team as a program manager, and what does that mean? Is means anything that's underneath or falls underneath Azure security, compliance, and identity. I'm one of the people that looks at it, makes sure that we need to do it, make sure there's customer demand. Just PM really the project. So from the beginning to like the very, very end to actually getting it published on Learn. And if you don't know what Learn already is, it's pretty simple. Just go to learn.microsoft.com. When you get there, you'll see, you're presented with a variety of different types of content. So you can pick up new skilling. There's also support for like certifications. So I'm actually studying right now for the AZ 500 exam,
Oh,
which is the security exam that Azure offers, because I feel like I need to maybe make sure I know this pretty well.
probably,
Um,
maybe
but
you're a security expert now.
I don't call myself an expert in
Yeah.
anything, but I pretend. And so anyway, you can really it's interactive and it's like hands-on learning. So
Sure.
as you're going through a module, there's several units attached to that module, and you may log into Azure. A lot they have sandboxes that are built in, so it's more along the lines of learning, but very structured learning based off of really Microsoft's existence
Yeah.
of content. And I agree with them. Obviously, fairly with what they're doing, because I've also used a lot of the same concepts like
Hmm.
quizzes, like asking, doing this a lot on stream. Hey, okay, before we move forward, we talked about this. What do you think this would do?
Sure.
So interactivity, and then letting folks, try it and yeah, and then help even contribute to it. So a
Yeah.
couple of really cool things.
Yeah, I know that, especially nowadays, it seems like everybody is getting compromised or hacked or whatever. I think security is something that's extremely important, and developers should have it, top of mind when they're building out solutions. And it's awesome to hear that, you know, the folks that are building like the content about how to build secure systems or configure secure
Mhm.
systems, like you're a part of that team, because I think I don't want to say you're a great developer or a good developer, but I think you do have a good, you want people to be safe and you want to do the right thing, which I think is super important.
Yeah, and there is really good stuff coming. I'm working with, we have security, cloud advocates. And so, anyways, there's some pretty sweet stuff. I'm really pumped for what we call our Q3, which is what starts in January.
Mm.
I'm really excited for a lot of that, and then for really the second half of our fiscal, which runs. January through June.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I
which
had to
is
think about it for a second too. Yeah.
but yeah, lots of really cool stuff happening. A lot of stuff that I'm really pumped about and I'm excited to be a part of.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you told me that you were heading out, like I was super sad. But then when you kind of talked to me about the gig, and I can just hear how excited you were to kind of be working with that stuff, because you were talking about security stuff on stream a lot, and I
Mhm.
think that I think that's where your interests were starting to go towards, which I think is super awesome. Um, so, as we close out, I want to thank you first off, Michael, for coming on the stream and chatting with us. You also have a stream as well. So,
Yeah.
folks, if you already aren't following MB Crump, like, please do. If you want to, what days do you stream? You stream
Wednesdays
Wednesdays
around
and
noonish,
okay,
so and a little bit here,
yeah,
and then on Saturday and Sundays around 10 a.m. Pacific Standard Time, which I've had several people, including Smash 8 Tap, who's been asking me to go earlier for different time zones. I'm getting close to thinking about it,
yeah.
but not all the way. Yeah, so yeah, the time zone thing is such a difficult.
It's hard. It's hard. Yeah. Like I interviewed Michelle Mannering, who you know. She's on the live coders
Yeah.
with you. She works at GitHub. She lives in Australia, and we were just trying to coordinate. Okay, like what is a time that's gonna not be inconvenient for both of us, and people are actually gonna watch. And we settled on something, and that was a fun chat. So, that's why I'm glad that all this stuff is available on YouTube. Like I'll publish this out to YouTube like before the end of the day, so like people always have the opportunity to see them. But they do want to be a part of the live experience. So I imagine we're gonna have to figure out this thing. I don't know if I have to do it twice a day or whatever, but which I probably would never do. But
I have learned with Australia, 2:30 our time
mm-hmm.
is 9:30,
Yeah.
I think, a.m. theirs. I have actually one of the advocates works in Australia or lives out of Australia, lives in Australia. And so whenever I'm working with him, I finally figured out a perfect slot for him. It's like 9:30 a.m. his time,
Nice.
2:30 mine. So
That's awesome.
uh, that's a good time.
Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good advice. Is it trying to figure out like which time zones or which times are the best to kind of accommodate multiple time zones. So you're a much better streamer than I am. I basically tell my guests to accommodate when I'm available, which is terrible. Um, but regardless, you do have a stream coming up. Smash 8 Tap's already there waiting for you. So I want to thank you, Michael, for coming on. This was super fun. Love chatting with you. And so for all the folks that watched, this will be available on YouTube later today. I hope maybe you can check it out. Smash the bell, as the kids say on my YouTube channel and my Twitch stream.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, enjoy the rest of your day, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.